Every story leaves something behind, a whisper, a shadow. Welcome to the horror archives. Turn down the lights and step carefully, because once a story enters the horror archives, it never truly leaves.
Crawl spaces, the one part of a house most people never see. A few feet of dark, damp emptiness between your floor and the bare earth below. Most homeowners go years without ever opening that hatch. But sometimes, someone else does. Here are 4 true crawl space horror stories. This first story was sent in by a listener from South Carolina. He calls it the insulation that was warm. What makes this one unnerving is just how long the signs were there before he finally went looking. The first time I touched the insulation in my crawl space, it was warm, not like residual heat from the house above. Warm like skin. I'd bought the place 6 months earlier, a small ranch house in Colleton County, South Carolina. Single-story, brick foundation, built in 1974. The crawl space was maybe 2.5 feet tall, accessed by a small hatch on the east side of the house. The kind of space you never think about until something goes wrong. What went wrong was the smell. It started in October, a thick, sweet odor that settled into the hallway carpet and wouldn't leave. I thought it was a dead animal. Maybe a possum had crawled under the house and died. It happens, so I pulled on some old clothes, grabbed a flashlight and went in. The crawl space was dirt floor, vapor barrier laid down in patches that had mostly curled up over the years, copper pipes overhead, some wrapped in old fiberglass insulation that had gone yellow and saggy. I swept the flashlight in slow arcs, looking for a carcass. I didn't find one, but I noticed the insulation along the far wall looked different. It was newer, cleaner, bright pink rolls that had been carefully pressed against the foundation wall in a section about 6 feet long and maybe 3 feet wide. That struck me as odd. The previous owner hadn't mentioned any recent work. I crawled toward it. The smell was stronger there, but not exactly the same. It had a different quality close up. Less rot and more warmth, like the smell of a sleeping bag that someone just climbed out of. I put my hand on the insulation to pull it back, and that's when I felt it. The warmth, it radiated through the pink fiberglass, like a heating pad was behind it. I yanked my hand back and just stared at it. Then I heard something. Faint, a low, congested sound, like breathing through a blocked nose, coming from behind the insulation. I didn't pull it back. I backed out of the crawl space on my elbows and knees so fast, I scraped my forearms raw on the dirt. I called the county sheriff. 2 deputies came out. I told them what I heard and they looked at me like I was wasting their time. But they went under. I waited by the hatch. They were under there for maybe 4 minutes before one of them shouted. The other one came out fast, his face completely white, and told me to go inside and stay there. Behind the insulation, they found a shallow depression dug into the dirt, about the size of a person. It was lined with old blankets and plastic sheeting. There were food wrappers, water bottles, a phone charger plugged into a spliced wire running off my electrical. Someone had been living in my crawl space. But the thing that bothered the deputies most wasn't the nest. It was the hole in the floor of the crawl space, directly beneath my hallway. Someone had cut a small rectangular opening through the subfloor. It had been covered with a piece of plywood that could be slid aside from below. They never found whoever it was. The deputies told me it looked like the space had been occupied recently, maybe within the last day or 2. The blankets were still warm when they pulled them out. I stayed in a motel for 2 weeks. When I came back, I had the crawl space hatch padlocked, the subfloor patched and reinforced, and a camera installed pointing at the foundation. The camera caught something on the 3rd night. Around 2:40 a.m., a figure walked into frame from the tree line behind my house. They stood at the edge of the foundation for 11 minutes, not moving, just looking at the padlocked hatch. Then they turned and walked back into the trees. I sold the house 5 weeks later. I never learned who it was, but what keeps me up at night isn't the figure on the camera. It's the phone charger. It was plugged in and drawing power from my wiring, which means that person had been under my house, awake in the dark, charging a phone, while I slept 10 feet above them. The next story comes from an HVAC technician who found something he was never supposed to see. He calls it the scratches on the vapor barrier. This one is less about what was in the crawl space and more about what had been. There were scratches on the underside of my floor, not from an animal. They were letters. I was an HVAC technician for 9 years in Middle Tennessee. Crawl spaces were my office. I'd been in hundreds of them. You see weird stuff sometimes. Old toys, liquor bottles, the occasional animal skeleton. But this one was different. The call was a routine maintenance check on a heat pump for an older couple in Dixon County. Nice people. The husband walked with a cane, and the wife kept offering me sweet tea. Their house was a modest split level built in the early 80s, and the crawl space access was through a vent panel on the north side. I suited up and went in. Standard crawl, vapor barrier on the ground, ductwork overhead, the usual spiderweb curtains. The heat pump's air handler was about 20 feet in, mounted on a platform near the center of the house. I was on my back, checking the refrigerant lines when my flashlight caught something on the subfloor above me. At first, I thought it was water damage, dark marks in the wood, but when I angled the light, I could see they were carved. Someone had scratched words into the underside of the floor with something sharp. The first thing I made out was a date, November 3rd, 1987. Below it, scratched in shaky capital letters, were the words "still here." My stomach dropped a little, but I told myself it was probably some contractor's graffiti. People carve things in crawl spaces. It's not that unusual. Then I swept the light further and found more. Dozens of scratches, different dates, different messages. They spread across the subfloor in clusters, some neat and deliberate, others frantic and overlapping. Can hear them above me. Day 6, I think. Please. He locked the vent. One section near the far wall had been scratched so deeply, the wood was splintered. It just said the same word over and over. Help, 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 help. I lay there on my back in the dark, reading these messages, and I felt the crawl space shrink around me. The air got thick. I could hear the couple's television through the floor above me, a game show, and the contrast made it worse. I finished the job as fast as I could and got out. When I was packing up, I asked the couple if they knew anything about the history of the house. The wife said they'd bought it in 1995 from an estate sale. The previous owner had lived alone. An older man. He died in the house. I asked if he'd had any family. She said she thought there'd been a son, but nobody had seen him in years. The neighbors assumed he'd moved away. I reported what I found to my supervisor. He told me to note it in the service file and move on. I called the non-emergency line for the sheriff's department and described the scratches. The officer I spoke with took down the address and said someone would look into it. I drove past that house 2 weeks later. There was no police tape, no signs of investigation, just the same quiet house with the same blue sedan in the driveway. I've thought about those scratches almost every day since. The thing that haunts me is the dates. They span from October 1987 to January 1988. 3 months of messages carved into wood in the dark, beneath a house where someone was living normally above. And the last entry wasn't a plea for help. It wasn't a date. It was just 2 words, scratched very lightly, as if the person barely had the strength to press down. He wins. This next one is hard to tell because it involves a child. A father sent this in, and you can feel the fear in every detail. He calls it the vent that breathed back. And I'll just say, some things a 4-year-old says shouldn't be dismissed as imagination. I heard my daughter talking to someone through the floor vent. When I asked her who, she said the man who watches her sleep. My wife and I had moved into a house in Greenfield, Indiana, with our 4-year-old Sophie. It was a foreclosure, which meant it was cheap and came with problems: leaking faucets, bad wiring, a crawl space that smelled like standing water. But it was ours. Sophie's room was at the end of the hall. It had a floor vent near the closet that connected to the old ductwork running through the crawl space below. The previous owners had apparently disconnected the HVAC from that run, so the vent was open but inactive, just a metal grate over a rectangular hole in the floor that dropped into darkness. The first thing Sophie said about it was that the vent was breathing. She told me air came out of it at night. I checked and there was a faint draft which made sense. Crawl spaces can have air movement from outside vents. I taped a piece of tissue over the grate, and it fluttered slightly. Normal. A week later, she said the breathing got louder when she turned off her lamp. I told her it was just the house settling, the way parents do. Then she started having conversations. My wife heard it first. She was passing Sophie's room around 9 p.m. and heard Sophie whispering. She peeked in and Sophie was lying on the floor with her face near the vent grate, whispering into it. My wife asked what she was doing, and Sophie said she was talking to her friend. We assumed it was an imaginary friend. Sophie was at that age. We didn't worry about it. But then Sophie said something that changed everything. She was eating breakfast one morning, and she looked at me and said, very casually, that her friend wanted to know when we were going on our trip. We had been planning a weekend away. We'd only discussed it in the kitchen after Sophie was in bed. I felt something cold settle in my chest. I asked her what friend. She said the man in the vent. I asked what he looked like. She said she didn't know because it was too dark to see him, but he had a soft voice and he knew our names. I went outside, pulled off the crawl space access panel, and shined a flashlight in. I couldn't see much. The space was deep and cluttered with old ductwork, but directly beneath Sophie's room, I could see the underside of the vent grate, and beneath it the dirt was flat, packed down, like something had been pressing against it. I called the police. They sent 2 officers who searched the crawl space. They found a duffel bag pushed against the far foundation wall. Inside was a change of clothes, a disposable phone, a bottle of water, and a small digital voice recorder. The recorder had files on it, hours of files. Most were silent, but some had audio. The sound of my wife and me talking in the kitchen, Sophie singing to herself, my wife on the phone with her mother. And one file was a man's voice, very soft, saying, "Good night, Sophie, sleep tight." The police tracked the phone, but it was a burner. No prints on the bag, no DNA results that matched anyone in the system. The crawl space had 3 external vents, any of which were large enough for a person to squeeze through. We sealed every vent. We poured concrete over the crawl space access. We installed cameras and motion sensors. We did everything. But here's what I can't stop thinking about. The voice recorder had a date stamp on the first file. It was from 11 days before we moved in, which means whoever this was didn't follow us to the house. They were already there. They were in the crawl space before we arrived, and they stayed. And they learned our names, our routines, our plans. Sophie still talks about her vent friend sometimes. She says he told her he'd see her again soon. She says it like it's nothing, like it's normal. And every single time, I check every vent in the house. Every time they're sealed shut. But last week, I found a piece of tissue taped over the grate in Sophie's room. I didn't put it there. My wife didn't put it there. It was fluttering. This last story is the most disturbing one I've come across on this topic. It was sent in by a veteran living alone in Georgia. He calls it the footage from underneath. I'll warn you now, this one doesn't end well. I found a camera in my crawl space that was pointed up through a hole in my bedroom floor. It had been recording for 2 years. I need to explain something first. I am not someone who scares easily. I spent 8 years in the Army, 2 deployments, and I've lived alone since my divorce in 2019. I bought a small house outside of Macon, Georgia, in 2020. Quiet street, big yard, no hoa. The house was built in 1968 and had the original crawl space, maybe 30 inches of clearance, access through a hatch in the back porch. I never went down there. I had no reason to. The house worked fine. No smells, no sounds, no issues. For 2.5 years, I lived in that house and never once opened the crawl space hatch. Then the floor in my bedroom started to sag, just slightly, enough that I could feel it give when I stepped in a certain spot near the foot of my bed. I figured it was a joist problem, maybe rot from moisture, so I finally opened the hatch and went under. The crawl space was dry, cleaner than I expected. Vapor barrier was intact, pipes looked fine. I worked my way toward the bedroom, dragging myself on my stomach because the clearance was tight. That's when I saw the wire, a thin black cable running along the top of a floor joist, stapled in place neatly, like professional work. It ran from the direction of my electrical panel toward the center of the house. I followed it. It led to a small device mounted to the underside of the subfloor, directly below my bedroom. It was a camera, a small wireless camera, the kind you can buy online for $40. It was attached to a bracket that had been screwed into the wood, and it was aimed upward through a hole. The hole was maybe the diameter of a pencil, drilled cleanly through the subfloor and the carpet padding above. I didn't touch it. I backed out of the crawl space and called the police. The forensics team that came spent 3 hours under my house. They found not one camera but 4. One under my bedroom, one under my bathroom, one under my living room, and one under the guest bedroom I used as an office. Each one was wired into my home's electrical. Each one had a small wireless transmitter that connected to a receiver they found mounted inside a junction box near the crawl space hatch. That receiver was connected to a hard drive. The hard drive had 2 years and 3 months of footage, over 19,000 hours of video. Someone had set this up before I moved in, and it had been running continuously since the day I arrived. The footage was organized into folders by date. The police reviewed a sample and told me what they found. Me sleeping, me changing clothes, me on the phone, me eating dinner alone at my kitchen counter. Every private moment of my life for over 2 years, recorded from below. But the worst part wasn't the cameras. It was the other footage. Mixed in with the files organized by date were separate folders labeled with single letters, A through F. Those folders didn't contain footage from my house. They contained footage from other crawl spaces, other bedrooms, other people sleeping, living unaware. Different angles, different homes, but the same camera setup, the same clean holes drilled through the floor. Folder A was dated 2014. Whoever did this had been doing it to people for at least 8 years across multiple houses. The police told me they were investigating, but couldn't share details. They took the hard drive. They took the cameras. They told me to change my locks and consider staying somewhere else. I asked them one question. I asked if any of the other footage showed the person who installed the cameras. The detective paused and said that in 2 of the folders, there were brief clips that appeared to be recorded accidentally when the camera was being adjusted. They showed a pair of hands, just hands, working calmly and precisely in the dark. They never identified the person. I moved out of that house a month later. I now live in a 2nd-floor apartment with concrete slab construction and no crawl space. But here's the thing that still wakes me up at 3 a.m. When the forensics team was under my house, they found fresh footprints in the dirt near the receiver. Not old prints, fresh ones. Someone had been in my crawl space within the last few days. They had come back to check the equipment. And the crawl space hatch, the one I said I'd never opened in 2.5 years. It wasn't locked. It had never been locked. It didn't even have a lock, just a latch that anyone could open from the outside. For 2 years, someone had been coming and going beneath my house while I slept above them. And I wonder sometimes how many nights they didn't just check the equipment. I wonder how many nights they stayed. I wonder if they were under me right then, listening to me breathe, while I lay in bed thinking I was alone. If you have a crawl space in your house, when was the last time you checked it? Think about that tonight.
And that's where tonight's file closes, but the archives are far from empty. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and join us as we uncover more horrors, mysteries, and true crimes hidden in the horror archives. Until next time, keep the lights low, keep listening, because you never know what story we'll uncover next.